Europeans respond with reciprocal tariffs. And since 75% of the exports at that time, I mean, it varied from year to year, but on the whole, like up to the end of the Civil War, about 75% of American exports came from the South, right? Whereas the northern industries was more of a domestic deal. And obviously, of course, because the northern industries were subsidized domestic industries, it was the southern industries that were actually competitive, although competitive for reasons that are morally reprehensible. And so, yeah, so obviously the tariffs were helping. I personally believe that they were actually hurting the North as well, but it was perceived that they were helping the North and hurting the South. And it's certainly true that they were hurting the South more than they were hurting the North, even if they were also hurting the North as well. But yeah, and so you had the first tariffs in 1824. I think you might have had some smaller ones before then, but the first big tariffs in 1824. Then you had a real uptick in the tariffs in 1828. And in this year, I don't know when Virginia did it, and I don't know, I forget which one came first, but Virginia and South Carolina thumbed their noses at the tariffs, and they said, we're not paying these ridiculous, retarded, insane tariffs. And they didn't. And in response, Congress said, all right, we'll lower the tariffs. And so they lowered the tariffs. But they're still paying the tariffs. All the southern states are still paying the tariffs in a perceived benefit for the North and a perceived hardship for the South, although not perceived, truly a hardship for the South. And then, so yeah, that's what happened. And in 1860, about 90% of all government revenue came from tariffs. Came from I forget what they call them. Yeah, tariffs. They came from tariffs, right? About 90% of all government revenue came from tariffs, and which predominantly hurt the South. And you probably say that, a good estimate is that the South was funding about 2/3 of the United States government at the time. It was servicing about 2/3 of the government costs, which were going to subsidize northern industries in this mercantilist, piece of shit that it was. And of course, this was the big issue of the day, not slavery. When Lincoln was running for president, he won because he kind of kept his mouth shut about tariffs. Because in the northern states, now even in the northern states, it wasn't like, all northern states were pro-tariff and all southern states were anti-tariffs. There was some debate amongst the northern states, and the way Lincoln won the northern states was by keeping his mouth shut on tariffs. Okay, for example, in the Midwest there were more anti-tariff, and in the Northeast there were more pro-tariff. And so what Lincoln did was he couldn't say one thing to one audience and another thing to another audience. So what he did was he just said nothing to nobody, and he would leak pro-tariff documents to the Northeast and leak anti-tariff documents to the Midwest. And he wouldn't waste any time in the South, I don't think. I don't think he spent a whole lot of time campaigning in the South because he knew he wouldn't get it. As a Republican, he wouldn't get any of the southern states. And so that's kind of what he did. He kind of gave a wink and a nudge to both the Midwest and the Northeast on the issue of tariffs. But of course, once he became president, he became adamantly pro-tariff. And his position on slavery was kind of opportunistic, to say the least. As he was campaigning, he didn't want to end slavery, didn't want to curtail slavery in the southern states, but he wanted to prevent slavery from expanding out west. And it's tempting to look at that as just, oh, Lincoln's just being pragmatic. Oh, Lincoln, he recognizes that slavery is a moral evil, but also recognizes the dynamic of the time. Well, more like another reason for that would be that the northern United States was not like anti-racist, anti-slavery, and all that stuff. People in the northern United States were fairly racist as well. And the sentiment at the time in the northern United States was that they didn't want a whole bunch of black people out in the West. They wanted to keep the West white. They wanted a white Western United States, and so they wanted to prevent slavery from the United States in that way. Also, at the time, slave states voted Democrat, and Lincoln was a Republican, so he didn't want a whole bunch of he didn't want like New Mexico, and he didn't want the Southwest, like growing cotton with slaves and becoming just an extension of the South. He didn't want that. He didn't want an extension of the South, so he opposed the expansion of slavery into the South. So yeah. And so then the shit started hitting the fan, right? Southern states started to get a little bit uppity about the tariffs, and eventually started to secede, started wanting to have limitations on the tariffs and all that stuff, and Lincoln wouldn't budge. In 1828, Congress budged and lowered the tariffs, but in what year it was when they were having this debate on eliminating the tariffs or lowering the tariffs, Lincoln wouldn't budge. And of course Lincoln wouldn't budge because 90% of government revenue came from the tariffs. So basically, if you lower the tariffs, you're lowering the size of government, and if you lower the size of government, you're lowering the amount of goodies you can hand out to all the big business in the North, all the big industrial conglomerates in the North. And so if he banned the tariffs, that would be the end of Lincoln. Even if he limited the tariffs, that could be the end of Lincoln, because he got all his money and he got a lot of support from businesses, which got money from government, which was based on the tariffs, right? Remember, this is just the whole state fascist dealio. And so Lincoln was not going to budge on the tariffs, and because he wasn't going to budge on the tariffs, the southern states said, all right, well then, if you're not gonna respect our well-being as states, the Confederacy formed. I'm not going to go into, or do I particularly even care the particulars about how the Confederacy formed or what state did what first, but the Confederacy formed and said, we secede and we're being our Confederacy thing here. And how did Lincoln respond to this? Well, he responded to this by saying, please don't go, guys, please don't go. I am willing to make a constitutional amendment. All right, you hear that? Lincoln is willing to sign a constitutional amendment, forever allowing slavery in the southern states. We will never deal with slavery in the southern states. I'm willing to sign a constitutional amendment protecting slavery. He was willing to sign a constitutional amendment protecting slavery, but he was not willing to budge 1 inch on the tariffs. Okay, and that should tell you all you need to know about Lincoln, about where he stood on the issue of slavery. But of course, the war was about tariffs, and the southern states said, nope, we're not doing it, and we're going to leave. And so the southern states said, we're going to leave, and so I don't know if they had the Confederal Convention or whatever, and they said, all right, we're leaving the Union. And so they left the Union, and what's not known is that in 1861, I think, doesn't matter, the Confederal Convention actually sent a delegate to Washington, and they were going to agree to assume their portion of the national debt. They were going to agree to assume a representative portion of the national debt based on population or GDP or something. They weren't shirking their part of the debt. All right, they were willing to have an orderly transition and do it in a way that wouldn't lead to war. And so the Confederate States did not want a war. Okay, it was Lincoln who wanted a war.